Ready? Okay, well, it looks like it's time we can get started. We have a full house anyway, so that's great. Thank you for being here. My name is Kirby Lambert, and I'm with the Outreach and Interpretation Program here at the Historical Society. And I'm going to immediately turn it over to John and let him take over from here. So,
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kirby. Thank you all for coming. The normal appreciations, I'm going to skip those. Those are all in the book. And instead, I would take the few minutes to talk about the months I was at the Pentagon trying to get all the education institutions in the U.S. Armed Forces to work together. And the biggest problem is they're institution-centered rather than learner-centered. And so the idea is to get it learner-centered so that a person can look at a subway map of education and move through it, get what they need for where they're going and based on what they used to know. And what I like about the archives and the museums here in Montana is that they're learner-centered. I'm still learning, obviously, but I can go to the military museum and get help out there from those folks. I could come here and get help in the photo archives and in the archives in the museum. And in the library downtown, going up to the archives in Butte, wherever. Go to the reservations, talk to the different schools. And it's really a learner-centered situation. So it may not have been planned that way, but to me, it's a very advanced way of educating ourselves. And I really appreciate that. The problem with it is you have clashing rice bowls in the Pentagon, they call it. So people are anxious to get that money. And so to keep it going, we all have to try to spread around our support to keep these fine facilities going. So that's all I'm going to say about that. The other thing I want to mention is the guy that did this cover is back in the back of the room, Seth. So you may want to have him sign the book, because if you got his signature, it's going to be worth something, all right? You can see there's a lot of things in here that I would love to be able to read to you, but we won't have the time, and I just don't want to take your time. But it's not what I wrote, it's what other people have said. There are a lot of quotations in here. But I am going to take my time to read one longer one that kind of sets the tone, and it's about war. You know, we're living in an age of chicken hawks. And they're dangerous because they really don't know what they're talking about. But people who have been in war, they do know what they're talking about, and they don't go to war lightly. So I want to read this quote because this person obviously knows about war. He said, "My horse," and by the way, the person is this guy right here. This guy. He's a big guy. I mean, physically a big man. He doesn't look like he's a big man because his brother's right here. But these guys are probably taller than me, and I'm big, you know. So this guy right here, and his name was Big Brave. Big Brave. That's what they called him since he was a kid. And this is what he said. And this picture was taken up in the Cypress Hills. That's up here. Up in the Cypress Hills, they're pagan. They're Blackfeet. Back in 1879. And he's talking about something that happened when he was, then he's 31, when he was 22 years old, back in 1970. "My horse and myself were both covered with blood. Let me tell you about this battle. The camp was on the Old Man's River. The bands were so many that they were camped on every bend in the river. I was 22 years old at the time. It was the fall of the year, and the leaves had all fallen. The people were just getting up in the morning when the news came that the Crees had attacked the lower camp. I got my best horse. It was a gray horse. My father led his band in company with Big Lake, who that summer had been elected Big Chief. We rode up over the ridge while in the plain below the battle was raging. As we rode down the hill slope, I began to sing my war song. I carried a shield in my hand, and this song that I sung belonged to that shield. One of the medicine men dreamed that whoever held this shield would not be hit by the bullets. While singing, I put in the words, 'My body will be lying on the plains.' When I reached the line of battle, I did not stop, but rode right in among the Crees, and they were all shooting at me from behind and in front. When I rode back the same way, the men made a break for the coulee. As soon as the men got into the coulee, they dug a pit. I was lying about 10 yards away on the side of the hill. I was singing while lying there. I could not hear on account of the roar of the guns and could not see for the smoke. About that time, they heard my whistle, and the Crees made a break for the river. Then the Blackfeet made an onrush for the Crees, and I ran over 2 of them before they got to the river. As they were crossing the river, I jumped off my horse and took my spear and stabbed one of the Crees between the shoulders. He had a spear, and I took that away from him. I jumped on my horse again, and just as I turned, there was a Cree who raised his gun to fire at me. I ran over him, and he jumped up and grabbed my horse by the bridle. I swung my horse's head around to protect myself and took the butt of my whip and knocked him down. When I struck him, he looked at me, and I found that his nose had been cut off. I heard afterward that a bear had bitten his nose off. After I knocked him down, I killed him. I jumped on my horse, and just then I met another Cree. We had a fight on our horses. He shot at me, and I shot at him. When we got close together, I took his arrows away from him, and he grabbed me by the hair of the head. I saw him reach for his dagger, and just then we clinched. My war bonnet had worked down on my neck, and when he struck at me with his dagger, it struck the war bonnet. I looked down and saw the handle sticking out, so I grabbed it, and I killed the other Indian. Then we rushed the Crees into the pit again, and my father came up with one of the old muskets and handed it to me. It had 7 balls in it. When I fired it, it kicked so hard it almost killed me. I feel that I had a more narrow escape by shooting that gun than I had with the Indians. When we returned, I had taken 9 scalps. The Crees, who had not been scalped, had taken refuge in the scant forest, and my father said to quit and go home. So he took pity on the tribe and let them go home so they could tell the story. I remember that we killed over 300, and many more that I cannot remember. When we returned, we began to count how many we had killed. We crossed the river and went into the pit, and they were all in a pile. Then we were all singing around the pit, and I put in the words, "The guns, they hear me." And everybody turned and looked at me, and I was a great man after that battle. So, this was in October of 1870. It was 9 months after the heavy runner massacre on the Marias River, which was in January 1870. It was a lot of gunfire in a time when the Plains Indian could rarely get their hands on gunpowder. And there's obviously a lot of it. Start at the end of the story to go back to the beginning. Well, I'll figure this out here in a minute. So this is one of my favorite maps. This is the map of Montana for the legislature. Right, it was in the middle of the first legislature in Bannock, and I just want to draw attention to it. So I want to say a couple of things. In the book, if you decide to, you'll see in the book there's a website for this map, and I decided the best way to do this was to put use your electronic media to go to that map, be able to blow it up right down to a gnat's eyebrow, because this map is fantastic. These guys, they did an amazing job for 1865. Right up here is the trace of the Fisk expedition in 1862. And they covered a lot of ground. They got to Fort Benton and disbanded, and some went up on top of the pass up here by Helena, wherever that is here. And they fired off the howitzer they had with them, which is the first time that howitzer had been fired, to celebrate just being here. And then they went on down to Bannock, and then they gave the howitzer to the governor of the Chief Justice for the Idaho Territory at the time was Edgerton. And then that same year, 1862, is when they had the Masonic funeral, and 77 Masons showed up, and then from that they started forming the part of the vigilantes in that part of the state. That was 1862. Well, by 1864, the guy, Edgerton, the howitzer, they were Montanans. They became part of Montana. So our first big gun was that howitzer. And that was down here. And then over here in Virginia City, in 1865, I want to look at the terrain first before we talk about some of these other things. You saw that road. The other road I want you to see is this one right here. Nobody ever talks about it, the Graham Wagon Road. Everybody talks about the Mullen Road, which is way important. It goes down here and then hooks around, and you got to go get at it from Virginia City going up to Helena, go north, go up to Silver City, catch it. But the Graham Wagon Road came down the other side of the Missouri, and it basically followed the terrain. And it was a road that was being used by the Indians, and then William Birkin from Diamond R Freight, he kind of developed into a wagon road. But it was kind of the back way into Confederate Gulch and Diamond City and so forth when they took off. So there was really two ways to get up to Fort Benton, get up from down in this part of the world. And then the other thing I want to draw to your attention is, since this was done at the midpoint of that first legislature, there's 9 counties, right? You got Missoula, Deer Lodge, Choteau, Bighorn. Then down here you got Beaverhead. Then you got Madison's way down in here. You got Gallatin, then Edgerton, and then Jefferson's in the middle. Well, 9 counties, but really, this area here, Bighorn, I mean, if you're going to go for the Indian vote, you're just out of luck, because they're going to lift your hair, no question. And then, I mean, that was bad. That was tough country out there. And then the same with the Gallatin area. And Gallatin County went over to the other side of the Shields River, which is right here. And the little town of Gallatin City, let's see if I can see that. It's hard to see this map up here. But in this general area, it's down where Three Forks are. Gallatin City had administrative control of both counties, Gallatin and Bighorn County. This little town of Gallatin City controlled about half the state of Montana, half the territory of Montana. So I just want you to know that. And the other thing for this story is, even though they hadn't been created yet, by the time 1867 rolled around, 2 more counties had been created over here around Diamond City and over here around where Martinsdale is and White Sulphur, and in there, or east of there. They were Marr County and Musselshell County. They'd been created. In fact, they were thinking of changing one of them to a different name when all the work of the first 2 legislatures got nullified. But in spite of that, the judicial districts, the judges, Hosmer, Munson, and those guys, they needed to have something to work with, so they went ahead as though they hadn't been nullified. So for this story, there was 2 more counties that's really pretty relevant. And, I'll explain later. So we've got 9 counties, in fact, on this map, and then think of 2 more. And I'm not quite sure what the boundaries for those 2 counties are. Probably bigger than what they are now. All right, so over here, this little map, if you get, I didn't know we'd have this great facility, but it's hard to see the detail. The detail you'll be able to see on your computer. If you blow it up, you'll be able to look at this stuff. And by the way, this map is annotated, I did it on purpose, to 1871. So all these notes on here, all these are new gold strikes since 1865. So the map's kind of cool because it shows Diamond City, whereas the original map wouldn't, because it was all changing so fast. So I did that on purpose, but it's kind of cool. It's very helpful. But anyhow, so you can see here it says a working map of Montana to 1871. And what I try to do is show what some of the things happened in 1865 through 1867, so you get a sense of the big picture. And if you get a chance to look at it, you'll see that those little orange spots, that's things that happened prior to the end of 1865. So you got Edgerton down here, and you got the Cannon, and then over here you got Marr showing up in late 1865, and if it's helpful to a point. It basically shows you a pattern, but and then the pink are things that happened in 1866. Well, in 1866, after Marr was up here in Fort Benton trying to get this Upson Peace Treaty agreed to, which was no problem at all. They came up with gifts. The Indians said, "Give us our gifts." They went around, peddled them, got the signatures, went home, and Marr, basically on his way home, stopped down at Sun River to see John Healy, who was another Irishman from New York. And basically, I think, got educated by Healy. Father de Smet said they were good friends, and I believe that. They had a lot in common. So Marr stayed there with Healy for about 2 weeks. And Munson and Howie and Meagher, who had gone up with acting Governor Marr for the peace treaty, they went on home. But before he stopped to go see Healy at Sun River, they had to go back up to Fort Benton, because when Howie came down, he came down behind Munson and Marr, and he said, the Indians are back on the warpath. They may have signed a peace treaty, but they're going to kill each other. So Marr went back up there, and they took that cannon. They had the one cannon. The crew that on the cannon were Meagher and Howie, and they brought the cannon out of Helena, and they caught up with Marr and his party going up to Fort Benton. So they went up there, and Marr basically stood out there in front of that cannon, and he says, if you folks don't go home, I'm going to kill all of you. Well, earlier, that's when that famous incident happened where Meagher had found this 4-pound pack howitzer on the back of a mule train, and it was going to display the might of the howitzer, and the mule went around in circles, and everybody had to dive for cover, and the Indians were entertained like crazy by this jumping mule, because the thing that made the mule jump was when they lit the fuse on the howitzer, the sound of the burning, made the mule crazy. So, but still, it must have left an impression, because when Marr came back the next day with a real cannon, I mean a bigger one, a 12-pounder, they all went home. So maybe it was in his demeanor, I don't know, but both Munson and Howie said, yeah, he made it stick, and without killing anybody. So anyhow, that's all on here. It doesn't show very well, but it shows up as a blue dot on a pink thing. And then another thing that happened is that was 1865, but then as it moved into the 1865-66 winter, it was a really bad winter, and it talks about it in the book. But that's when the fighting started, and I think it started because of horse stealing. The non-Indians didn't like having all their stuff stolen all the time. And one of the things about Montana that's not shown on the terrain is everybody drank. The white guys, the non-Indians drank 40 rod, which would just stupefy you at some distance. And they were drinking all the time, and there was people selling them the stuff all the time. And up on the reservations, or wherever there were people gathered, there were whiskey drummers selling the same stuff as firewater. And so you had whatever exacerbates normal things that keep people apart. The firewater did it big time. So you had Father Giorda up working with the Indians, writing to Upson. The Indian agent said, these people are selling their wives, their daughters, they're selling their horses, they can't get buffalo. This is not going to end well. And then down in Virginia City, you had a guy like Barney Hughes, who everybody liked. Him and Granville Stewart got together later in Butte at the Butte Library. Granville Stewart was an old man and a librarian, and they talked about back when Ives got hung, and they couldn't understand why he did what he did, and then Hughes, he made the comment. He says that rot gut that we were drinking back then would cause anybody to steal from Christ on the cross. It was a similar problem in both places. People's judgment were very much impaired, which is part of the history of Montana. So what happened in that 1866 period is the Sun River people decided to form under Healy, and Marr may have been there. He may have been there. It may have happened during that 2 weeks that he was there, because the Jesuits have always considered the Sun River Rangers part of the Territorial militia. But they organized basically a self-defense force. They called themselves the Sun River Rangers, and Ranger Healy, who had military experience with the 2nd Dragoons, he was the man, and he had his squads out. And when Father, I think it was Giorda, he got snow blinded in that bad storm, and he was cared for, but he was trying to get away from a Blackfoot camp, because suddenly the Blackfeet were on the warpath, and even his friend said, you can't stick around here, they're going to kill you. They're mad at everybody. And so when he finally got where he was being cared for up by the old mission, up by Shodo, he started asking around, and they said, well, two Blackfeet were down at Sun River, And they were out on lookout duty along the river. This was in the winter of 1865, 66. And they watched the squad of men, and 4 other Blackfeet were in having dinner with a guy named John Morgan. John Morgan was married to a Piegan woman. And one of the riders, one of the Indian guests, was her brother. They were in having dinner, and the squad came up of 10 men, led by a guy named Charlie Carson, and they got his name and everything. They were just sitting there in the bushes watching it. They went inside. The Indians were disarmed because they were having dinner, and they took each one out one at a time, all 4 men, and they put them all on the same horse, and they lynched them, and then they cut a hole in the ice, and they stuffed their bodies down in the ice, which coincides with other reports that the Sun River Rangers took care of for those horse-thieving Indians. So we had a cultural problem that was exacerbated. And John Morgan crops up quite a bit throughout the whole story, but I can't get into all the detail. But so that really made the Indians mad. And so they were down, and of course Morgan took his kids over to the mission at Ulm. The Sun River was the Jesuit mission there, St. Peter's, that was active at the time. And he said, please take my kids. I got to go to Helena on business. Well, the Jesuits said, well, I don't know if we want to take your kids. I mean, that's just like inviting disaster, which it did. They were attacked, and one of their field hands was killed. And then over at the Sun River farm, where the Territorials sometimes kept their ammunition and stuff, they attacked that, killed a man, blew the place up, burned it down. Then they went on down to Dearborn Crossing, and they caught up with Charlie Carson there. Charlie Carson, he went out to see what was bothering the horses, not realizing they were completely surrounded by Blackfeet. And when he saw them running off the horses, he tried to shoot one, but they were waiting for him, and they killed him. They put a bullet through his rifle up against his head and killed him. And John Healy, the ranger leader, said he was my best guy. So all this stuff was going on in 1866 along the Sun River between Dearborn Crossing and up to the Leavings, up in that area. Well, all along there was a lot of killings. And actually it was continuing, and Meagher was trying to get people, get help from the feds, and they sent some people up to operate out of the old Sun River Mission. And during that time, the Jesuits left the Ulm station, and they moved over to Birdseye, because they had been building that camp. And Meagher, he had stayed there. That's what saved him and his party when they were going up for the Upson Treaty. They were in a blizzard, heard dogs barking, went there and stayed with the Jesuits who were building that mission. Jesuits never got to use it. They stopped there one night. There was war parties going up and down the roads. There was people looking for trouble everywhere, and so they just decided to keep going over to the Mission Valley, and that's where they stayed for several years. So that was in 1866. And let me see if there's anything important. So about the militia. Now, by then there was already 2 militias. When Calf Shirt came down from up here, came down from the Old Man River, which up in Canada they call it the Belly River, but he rode down with 200 men because in early 65, some of his blood warriors, some of his best people, were walking the streets of Fort Benton telling people that, just getting in their face, and that they'd stolen 40 horses, and that was duly noted, and 3 guys pulled out their pistols and killed him. Killed the first guy, went and found his friends, killed them, threw their bodies into the Missouri. So a couple weeks later, when the woodcutters were up there by on the Marias, you'll see that highway marker when you go by there. They were cutting logs for a new town that was going to be at the mouth of the Marias called Orford. Suddenly, just like in the movies, all these Indians showed up on the ridgetop, 200 of them, led by the baddest guy you could possibly imagine. I mean, he'd killed members of his own family. He had a real reputation he's a blood Indian. And somebody had the bad idea to shoot at him. And that was it. They not only died, they died in very bad ways. So then the Bloods turned around, went back up. And later on, Healy was up there working with them when he was trading, and he got to know Calf Shirt. And the guy says, well, all I was going to do is go down and make some inquiries, right? So that didn't end very well. But what happened is Edgerton, down in Bannock, and Virginia City, They were starting to move over there. He said, let's get a militia together. So Edgerton and his nephew, Sanders, they were running around trying to get the people together. They got 30 people to go up and chase down these 200 Bloods. And Hosmer, who was a Republican Chief Justice then, he said, it's just a big bunch of hoorah. It's a waste of bad whiskey. And then it never came to anything. It's the worst looking horses I ever saw. And that's when Saunders got the name Colonel. That's when he was made a colonel by his uncle. He was the quartermaster colonel for that effort, which Hosmer called a waste of bad whiskey. But that was the first territorial militia. And Healy, who's up there in Sun River, who's pretty knowledgeable, his understanding was that James Stewart, Granville's brother, was going to bring them up north to help out, but that he found out the Bloods had gone back to Canada, and he exercised good sense, and he said, we're not going up there. Ain't going to happen, and which was a really good idea. So that was the first militia, and that was 65. In 1866, when this trouble broke out along the Mullen Road, we had the second militia, and what happened is the people up in Fort Benton, they really kicked the hornet's nest, right? So they're doing the self-defense thing. They got kind of a vigilante organization in Fort Benton. They got the Sun River Rangers down on the Sun River, and they're asking for help. So by then, Howie, who was he was the deputy marshal at the time, and he was also had been the lead vigilante. He was very well respected. He was the so-called adjutant general, made so by Edgerton. He goes down to talk to Marr, because now Marr is the guy in charge, and they have all these plans, and everybody wants to go kill Indians, and he has all kinds of people in Virginia City who want to do this. But he starts thinking about it as he's riding back up to Helena, because by now he's living in Helena, not Virginia City. He's living in Last Chance Gulch. And oh, by the way, he's got with him some of the baddest vigilantes on the planet. He's got Hereford, Featherston, Beadler himself, and Birkin from Diamond R. Those guys, if you want to get hung, they'll do it for you. And so they're up there. And so there's actually a second stage of vigilantes up in Helena. So he gets up to Helena and he decides, no, this is not a good idea, but what we will do, because Marr, and the orders that Marr gave, and Marr had no staff at all, because what happened, as soon as he said he was going to have a territorial militia, a second one, Saunders said, I'm out of here. So he resigned. So Marr had no staff except for Howie. And it says a lot for Howie, because he kind of went with all these different personalities. He's an interesting guy. He's quiet, but he's very interesting to me. And so he gets up to Helena, and by then, this is before Charlie Carson's been killed. Charlie Carson's down trying to get help. And so Howie sends 10 guys, plus Charlie Carson. They go up to help the people in Fort Benton along the Sun River. And there was kind of a mix of people. Other names showed up later. One name that crops up that I had never heard of before is this Charlie Curtis. He's an Irishman down here in Helena. He's a stage actor and ran a junk store. Guy was a tremendous officer. He could just get people going, and he'd get the job done and go home. So he was up there, and he came back with the boys, and he must have had a great time doing whatever he was doing. And so that second militia ended. But basically what it was some of Howie's friends like Quill Lawrence and some of his deputies. They went up there. So that was the second militia. So that was 1866. And those are the pink things, and we could talk about what happened in some of these other in pink. But in 1867, that's what we came here to talk about. So, but that's the background. I just want to make sure that you know that in 1866, let's go. Let's see what I got here. The winter of 1866-67. The reason I got into this, even interested in this, was kind of backed into it because I'm interested in electricity. I used to regulate electric utilities. And I was always interested in crazy things like, where was the first power pole in Montana? Well, if you wanted to know about that, first power pole in Montana was right there, right in front of the Creighton and Oley store in Virginia City. And it was for the telegraph, right? They started building it from Virginia City going south. They started planting poles, and then they went south to Salt Lake, the crews did, to pick up all their stuff, and then they built back up to Virginia City. So in the winter of 1866-67, the first big thing that happened, and it was a big deal, is not the telegraph, that's very important, but the very first kilowatt hour of electricity generated in Montana was in Virginia City. And it was not November 2nd when the first telegraph messages went back and forth to the president and so forth. It was October 27th when Barney Hughes, who was one of the discoverers of Virginia City, and they called him the lightning gobbler because he was working in the telegraph office, he had this plate of jars, and each one of those jars, was a battery, a primary battery that could generate electricity, and each one could generate the same as about a double A battery. And that's what he used to ring the sounder and all that stuff. And so when he tested that out down to Salt Lake City, that was the first generation in Montana. And I find that interesting. That's probably why I'm a little different about these things. The other thing that happened in 1866-67 is there was a bad gunfight out here at Diamond City. But it helps point up how the world looked then. Out in Cave Gulch, which is by Diamond City, which was in Confederate Gulch, Diamond City was about the same size as Last Chance Gulch. I mean, it's a pretty respectable burg. And what happened is 5 Irish Americans, got killed by an equal or larger number of German Americans who were in their portholed cabin and watching these Irishmen dig on what they thought was their claim, and they just put an end to it. They just put an end to the Irishmen, right? So what happened was, it's interesting. There was like 100 people out there with guns that were going to kill all these gosh darn Germans, right? And of course, the Germans had friends. So somebody sent to Helena for help, and Howie goes out there with Beadler and Quill Lawrence and some of these other guys to try to solve the problem. And it's a big deal. And they bring all kinds of people with them. I think more than 100 people that are armed. So they go out, they cause the Irishmen's friends to put down their guns, and then they talk to German Americans and they're coming out of the cabin where they'd done the shooting from, and then they brought them back across Canyon Ferry to Helena. And then they had a trial. And the trial didn't last very long. There was a recorder and a couple other people. They testified, and yep, that was the German Americans' claim, and everybody clapped, and they went back over and started digging gold. Well, meanwhile, the priest here in Helena, he goes over there when he heard about it, and he swims the river while the thing is still in high tension, and he gets the poor dead Irishmen and bring them back, and he tries to find a place to bury them because there's no Catholic cemetery yet. So the very first Catholic cemetery in Helena was on the bench above the hanging tree. That's where he found a place to plant these 5 good Catholic boys. So that was interesting because, number one, it tells you kind of how the mood was after the Civil War. It tells you about the relative size of the two communities. It tells you how one was dependent on the other. It tells you that everybody had guns, right? Okay. Then the other thing that happened, another thing that happened in that winter of 1866-67 was the Fetterman Massacre in December. And what happened was basically Lieutenant Colonel Fetterman Brevet, he came out with about 81 men outside the fort down at Phil Kearny, and he walked into an ambush, and it was over within just a matter of minutes. And they learned the hard way what, if you read Black Elk, the Sioux Holy Men, you read him. His father was in that fight. They were living down on the Little Piney, and he talks about how so many arrows were in the air that men came back wounded. His father got his leg broken, but it was not a good situation for the soldiers. And the reason was the soldiers had these 58 caliber Springfield rifles, and you'd have to, load them through the barrel, and it took time to do that. And the time you were loading that rifle in order to shoot the next target, you were a target. So the Indians, not being very stupid, but being very wise, they would wait when you were going to shoot, and they'd hide. Then while you were loading, they'd shoot you. And they could shoot real well with those bows, real well and real fast, and they'd come in, they would engage with their hand weapons, and they'd kill you, and it happened very fast. So that happened down there, and a lot of people who had been in the war, Civil War, already knew those weapons weren't worth too much, really. You didn't want to have them for those reasons. And that's why when Marr and those guys went north for the Upson Treaty the previous fall, take any guns and any of those kind of guns. And Meagher already had signed for 40 Springfield rifle muskets from the Niobrara Wagon Road Company that finished Niobrara River and Virginia City Wagon Road Company. They were out surveying. They'd brought in, with this Colonel Sawyer, they brought in a bunch of their arms, and they had to sign them over to somebody. So like Fisk did with the howitzer, they signed them over to Meagher. So we had 40 of them, 40 stand of arms with ammunition, I think 7,000 rounds of ammunition. But Meagher didn't take that with them when they went north. They took their personal weapons, because you could, a 6-shooter is a lot better than that thing you got to stand and load. So, and the howitzer was always a good thing. So that Fetterman massacre happened, but the thing is, even with the telegraph, we never heard about it for a while here. But we had the telegraph. Now, the other thing, I think those are I may remember something else that happened that winter, but those are big things that happened. And, the other thing that happened was on January 7th in that winter, Governor Green Clay Smith said, I got to go back to the States and take care of family things, do this, that, and the other thing. And I think he and Meagher were very close. Meagher had already told him that the only way to deal with General Sherman is you got to deal with his supervisor, which is Grant, because he called Sherman a martinet. And a lot's been made about how Sherman called Meagher a stampeder, fine. But really, when Clay Smith went back to Washington, D.C., he went and saw Grant. Grant said, what do you need? Told Sherman to give it to him, and that's how that happened. Everything else is background noise. So he was doing that, getting some guns and ammunition, and taking care of his own personal affairs. And at that time, so on January 7th, Meagher became the acting governor of Montana again. And the other thing that happened is there was that exodus early in the year. Sanders went back. He went back to get the last 2 legislatures nullified, and he also went back to get political appointments for his supporters and friends, which was Howie to be U.S. Marshal, Beadler to be the customs collector, and then the replacement for Meagher, Tuft, and then for, what was the other one? I can't think of it right now. But the political appointees, he wanted to go line those up, and he had a lot of influence back in Washington. But it's interesting to read Howie's diary. Howie really, he got along, but he really was relying on George Penny, who was the U.S. Marshal in Virginia City, who was going to step down. And so Penny was also going back, and Penny, on St. Patrick's Day, telegraphed out from Washington, the new appointment is Howie. And that was probably a pretty solid appointment. Then a couple days later from New York, there was kind of a more political thing, and that was Saunders saying, here we got our 5 guys, and already people knew that the legislatures had been nullified. That was filtering in. But by St. Patrick's Day in 1867, that's when it was clear that the government, the paid positions of government for the most part were kind of taken care of by Saunders. And Meagher already knew that his day he was done. He'd already told Hosmer he was going to be leaving and so forth, so that was no biggie. The thing to remember is Saunders had started his political campaign, right? I noticed on Google and all that, they say that position of the unelected delegate starts in, I think, March of that year. It didn't. The election for that position started in September of that year. So Sanders was campaigning all through the summer and fall to become the non-elected delegate back to Washington. As it turned out, he lost terribly to the Democrats because he was a very conservative Republican by those standards in those days. And so you had Southern rebels and you had Northern soldiers. They were the Democrats, and then you had the Republican group, and they were losing ground. And so when it was all over with, Saunders, through that time of campaigning, he lost by quite a bit, even with the militia people, to a guy named Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh is famous for being the person that originated the saying, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian," right? Which I won't. You'll concede in the book, but if you read in Montana, Montanans are like way worse than the people on the West Bank from Israel in the Middle East. I mean, it must be something that goes with going into a hostile environment, but they couldn't do anything wrong, and the people that they were fighting with couldn't do anything right. And basically, Montanans had an attitude. And you can see that when you read some of the stuff that's in the book. So whatever the militia did, when it was organized and sent out, and whatever Meagher did there, as you see in the handout, Montanans really liked it. They liked it a lot. And they didn't like Sherman, who seemed to be dragging his feet. Here's the other thing that happened right around St. Patrick's Day. St. Patrick's Day, the banquet was the night of the 18th. It was the day after, and it was a huge spread down in Virginia City. They had the pictures of George Washington, and they had the Irish flag of Ireland, the flag of America. They had, on both ends, they had all the, by then, Meagher had signed for another 40 rifle muskets. These are Enfields. And so they had all 80 of them, all field stacked, like little teepees. And they had the Territorial howitzer was back from being captured. I didn't mention that. It got captured out on the Muscle Shell when a work party got attacked by Blackfeet, and they had to leave it because they had no way to tow it. And then somebody went out and got it and bring it back. And so it's there at the party. And everybody just loved, it's like a really good party. And they were up all night having dinner and breakfast, and it was like the high point of good feeling. And then about that time, the whole Sanders thing, and they got to the last two legislatures were done away with, and so all that work on corporations and taxes and all the things that they had done for 2 sessions had to be done over again, except for those 2 counties. That the judges decided just to keep organizing around Muscle Shell and Meagher County. So between St. Patrick's Day and about the 8th of April, all kinds of things happened. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. It's in the book, and I tried to just give you slices of every 2 weeks, as if there was an AP giving you the press releases on what's going on in Montana Territory. Kind of consolidates different things because you have to follow different veins of what was happening over an 8-month period, right? And you can get the detail that I can't give you here. But it started with these general orders, and I want to spend the time talking about a couple of people. Not Meagher, not Sanders, not Edgerton, but like this guy here, Hull. Hull was the quartermaster of subsistence officer. They had a quartermaster, then they had a guy under the quartermaster that took care of weapons. They had a quartermaster of subsistence. And he took care of all the food. He put out all the bids and all that kind of stuff. And he had come in. This is the Territorial. This is the staff for the 4th Territorial Militia. I point this out. After the second one that was up there on the Sun River, and those guys came back, then after St. Patty's Day in 1867, Meagher starts the 3rd Territorial Militia. They didn't call it that, but it was the 3rd one. And then when after Meagher disappeared and what's his name, Smith comes back, he reorganizes it into a 4th. So these people are really Smith's staff in the 4th Militia after he's back and Meagher is dead. But this is a great picture because most of these players are all the same. However, this guy, Hull, who's the head of the Masons in Virginia City and was tied up when they were starting their new building down there and all that. He's pretty active. He actually replaced a guy named John Creighton. John Creighton was a Catholic. This whole thing about the vigilantes being Masons, I mean, yeah, that's true. But also there was a lot of people involved that weren't Masons. And John Creighton and Sanders, for example, were really good friends. And if you go to John Creighton's biography that was written by a Jesuit after he went back down to start Creighton University, he talks, and he's very proud of being involved with saving Sanders' life, of getting the word from Sanders to send his men over for the Ives after he made his move after Ives was found guilty, then to condemn him to hang that night. Well, that decision was influenced by Creighton sending his men over on a message from Sanders. And so, but the interesting thing about that is when you go to find those pages about his time as a colonel in the Montana militia and with the vigilantes and all that, They've been cut out of most of the biographies. So I went over to Gonzaga to get a copy to see what that was all about. But Creighton was the guy that brought the telegraph in, right? He had Creighton and Ole's store. He had sold subscriptions around town. He brought communications. He brought Montana into the modern world. And when they came up, they had 17 wagon loads of insulators and acid for the batteries and wire to extend the telegraph the next summer up to Helena. That was Creighton, and Creighton was a colonel in Mars militia, and he was a quartermaster of subsistence, commissary of subsistence. That's kind of a different phrase that's not used now, but his job was to feed people. And so he did that for a while, and then he said, I can't do this anymore. I got business to attend to. So he stopped, and this J.J. Hull took over. This guy, Henson, he rode with the first company. Somebody who's not here is Thomas Thurman, a Confederate officer. He was a really good officer from over in Bozeman, an attorney that everybody really liked, an easygoing guy. And Thurman was the field commander. Marr picked him right away, said, you're in charge out in the field. So when companies would roll into the Gallatin, they'd report for duty to Thurman. He'd say, you go here, you go here, you go here, and so forth. Well, Thurman also was commander of the 75 or so people from the Gallatin. They'd organized into a self-defense force by precinct. And so Henson, he had the first company coming out of Virginia City, Company A, the Virginia City Rangers. And he was a really good officer. And when his people got up there, and he later on became staff person, but when he was a company commander, one of his men wrote back and said, this is great. You know, there's 50 people in a company, and he says, we've got a soldier from every corps in Grant's army, we got a soldier from every corps in Lee's army, and we got 2 colored guys. And I'm thinking, that's what Montana was about. You know, I mean, it really was. And I don't know how people want it to be, but that's the way it was. Those are the ones that showed up. So you got Henson, and then this guy here is the one I want to talk about, Beam, Martin Beam. Martin Beam was the person that Marr decided to make the first adjutant general for the Territorial Militia. Beam is an authentic hero from the Civil War. During the Battle of Shiloh, which was pivotal in the whole western part of the Civil War, you know, for Grant and his man Sherman, they had gone up to the Tennessee River and they were unloading soldiers from 2 armies, and nobody was supposed to be there or know about them, and suddenly they wake up in the morning and there's 42,000 Confederates that weren't supposed to be there coming out to eat their lunch, right? So this guy, he wraps an American flag around himself and says, I'm not going anywhere. And that American flag, from several sources, has ended up in some kind of a memorial hall at West Point. Then, on top of that, after they do have to kind of beat a retreat, then he leads a counterattack, right? 18th Missouri. He leads a counterattack, and during that counterattack, the standard bearer for the unit gets killed, so he picks it up and keeps charging, and they get up far enough to hold the Confederates off, and that's what created the time, about 2 hours, necessary for Grant to put his last stand in, and he was able to withstand the Confederates, and then the next day go on the offensive, and it was huge. It was like the nail in Napoleon's horse's shoe. You know, I mean, he was the guy. Well, he got promoted, and then not only that, Sherman, who was calling Marr a stampeder, came and personally thanked him, right? Well, that's amazing. Well, this guy, what happened is he gets promoted in different things and goes through the war, serves out his enlistment. The 18th Missouri becomes the something or another Ohio in the middle, which makes it, they change the name because it's right across, what is it, the Ohio or the, I can't remember what the new name of it was, but it's got 2 names, and it changed right after Shiloh. But he stayed with it, served out his enlistment, is at Ioka in Corinth, and then he actually comes off the sick bed. He gets made a brigadier general, stays up for nights, days, leading the forces and so forth. I mean, tremendous guy. And then when he finally gets done with his enlistment, he goes over to Arkansas, and he becomes the adjutant that starts and builds loyal 4th Arkansas Mounted Infantry. And they have 5 companies, and they do all these things. There's all kinds of stuff about that. Well, he's the guy that did that. So he after the war, he just disappears into the West Indies. He goes down to Mexico, and he just happens, I guess, to be coming through Montana, and Meagher hooked him, right? This guy's an amazing guy. And if you Google him, you're going to find out that after he left here, he went to Chicago. He was an attorney in Chicago, and he ended up leading the largest Civil War veterans organization in the country. And he died mysteriously, but also he showed up at a lot of Irish things, Irish unionist type things later on, which I find interesting. I don't know why that is. But he's from Alton, Illinois, and it was interesting. Once he was made adjutant, the people from Alton, Illinois, who remember him as a guy too sick to join, so they wouldn't let him join, so he goes over to St. Louis to join the Missouri infantry. That's how he got in. They said, "You know who you got there?" And they sent, and it's in the papers here in Montana. They're saying, "You got quite a guy there." Well, so he really was quite a guy, and the people in Virginia City liked him. And when he came up to Helena later to help recruit in Helena, they liked him immediately. He was an easygoing person. Well, it's interesting. In the spring of 1867, a guy named Samuel Blythe, he'd spent a hard winter in the Gallatin. He'd been in the same unit with him. And he comes into town looking for work. He's all bearded and dirty from being out in the hills. And he goes to check into the planter's house, and there's a guy from his old unit there at the desk. And they said, "Well, so-and-so's here, Beam's here too." So Blythe actually goes to the trouble of talking about how valuable this guy was, what he really did. And he was tickled to see him. And then Beam got Blythe a job working for the Montana Post, because both Beam and Blythe were printers. That was their job. So this guy's a player, especially if you're talking about General Sherman, right? So there's that guy. And then over here, this guy is amazing. His name is Hamilton Cummins. He's an attorney in Virginia City. And Meagher picked him right away to be his quartermaster. So he's in charge of supplying everything: horses, rope, shoes, saddles, the whole thing, guns. And he comes up with the voucher system to do this. And he just makes things happen. And then this guy here is AMS Carpenter. He's the assistant postmaster at the Stewart and Dance store. Stewart and Dance is where the Montana Historical Society started, in that store. Well, if you go in, I'm not talking the post office later, I'm talking the one in that store. You go in, you'll see a little gold cage. Well, picture this guy would be the one with the postal hat on behind the cage, taking your money for whatever you're mailing. And it's just a little thing. Well, he was there. He came in because Virginia City had been made a first-class post office, so they could justify having an assistant postmaster. And Saunders' friend, Dr. Gibson, had the store, the pharmacy in the back of the store. He was the postmaster, but he hired this guy. So he was doing postmaster stuff until Meagher said, "I want you to be my superintendent of public instruction." He's Montana's 4th superintendent of public instruction. And oh, by the way, he's the first one to actually do the job. He went out and actually see if people were being taught. Well, he was hired 2 days before they found out. He accepted the appointment 2 days before they found out that the legislatures had been nullified, and he wasn't going to get paid, right? So he'd already signed on to be the ordnance officer for the territory. He's working for him. He's the ordnance officer. So when he leaves to go up to get the guns at Fort Benton as Montana Territory's ordnance officer, he doesn't have a job. So he's going up there to find a way to make work, and he'd been reading the law, so he gets involved in some legal disputes up there trying to make some money, which is kind of a militia type thing, right? So because everybody's living on the economy. They're trying to survive. They don't have a government check coming in. So this guy here is Neil Howey. He's quite an interesting person. I won't spend a lot of time, but this person would have been, he's the field commander, and that would have been Thurman if this was the 3rd militia. But by the 4th militia, he's the one that's the field commander. But remember, he had been the adjutant and the guy in charge during the 2nd militia and during the 1st. So during that 3rd militia, there's some tension between all of his supporters up in Helena and they don't kind of like Mar as much maybe. And so they want to have their own Helena battalion and their own stuff. Well, Beam, he wrote the orders. Those are no kidding military orders, and they're in the book. He said, this guy's going to do this guy's going to do this guy's going to do this, and there's no Helena battalion in there. Well, nobody told this guy, or Beadler, right, which may have precipitated a problem. So, and then the other thing is, the orders were written by the staff, which is the right way to do it, but then General Order Number 1 was written by Beam, who is the adjutant. He's in charge of all organization, all administration. And he's the one that calls the shots on who does what in the organization. It was really a very squared away operation, in my view. And then this is Smith. Smith, when he came back, his aide de camp by then was Penny. Penny got that job after Mar disappeared. His aide de camp was going crazy because this guy, he apparently had prior military experience, but he was writing orders. He had the aide de camp. I say, write an order on how to tie your shoe, and he writes the order on how to tie your shoe. So Smith would say, I want an order on you're supposed to obey orders. And he'd have to write that order. And I want an order to send 2 howitzers over here and 4 howitzers over here. And then the next day it was 2 howitzers. I mean, it's just like, get your act together, buddy. I mean, the guy was a problem. So Penny must have been just like going, this job is, I don't want this job, right? And by the way, he got away from it after a while. But so that's the kind of an officer that Smith was, hands-on when he didn't really know what he was doing, I think. So we deployed for 3 months. Now, this is where I save time. You've read the press releases. You kind of know what happened, right? It was a 3-month enlistment, or until replaced by the feds. And it happened only after Mar had asked the commander down at Camp Cook. Camp Cook had 800 men. 250 were upriver, but he had 600 men at Camp Cook. And he said, after Fetterman, he says, you saw what happened. I can't be defeated in detail. I can't come and help you. I got to take care of it. Was force protection. I don't want to have the same thing happen here. We got to stay inside the walls. So you had that. You had Jim Bridger, who's down at Fort C.F. Smith. That's the other thing that happened during the winter. Fort C.F. Smith got isolated. Nobody had heard from it. They never heard from the outside after December 1st. Nobody heard from Fort C.F. Smith for months. And so Jim Bridger's down there. And Jim Bridger writes up it's in the book, explaining the situation. He says, this is a bad situation. Everybody knows anything about this area knows these Indians are flat serious. And then when he finally got a relief column out of Fort Phil Kearny, Jim Bridger was on it going south. So people who say Mar was a stampeder, I don't think they got it. I think they're way off. This was a serious situation. The warriors that were downriver on the Yellowstone were all business, and I think the 3 things that Mar set out to do were accomplished by that 3rd militia. He wanted to restore confidence because people were running away from their farmsteads and so forth in the Gallatin. They were scared to death. And then he wanted to discourage the tribesmen from coming over the hill into the Gallatin. And that happened. Then there were several things, several points of contact. And then finally, he needed to get those guns. The guns that's a big thing. We're talking a lot of stuff. And that got accomplished too. Okay, but and this is Gallatin City. Remember that was in charge of about half the territory. And it never came to much, but at that time, everybody thought that was the place, but then everything kind of moved to Bozeman City. When they had their self-defense meetings over in the Gallatin, and they started organizing by precinct to defend the 7 passes into the Gallatin, they had the meeting on the postal road from Gallatin City to Bozeman City, which went by those hills that are by Amsterdam. And you get up in those hills where the farms are. Well, it was in there. It was called Elkanah Morris's store. It was like a general store. They had their meetings there. There's all kinds of people there, very alarmed and getting organized. And then they're the ones that sent for help from Mar and so forth. It's an interesting story, and what we all might do if we have to defend ourselves someday, how people organize. You know, the people up in in Fort Benton and Sun River, they did it one way. People in the Gallatin did it another way. All right. So okay, you've read a lot of the stuff that's going on. So in the press releases. So I'm not going to go to that, but I want to take a few minutes to talk about what happened. Remember, Meagher was an experienced military officer, and so was Smith. And they met each other on the road. And Meagher didn't expect Smith by July 1st because he had decided he's not going to get here in time, so I got to reapportion the territory, which he did. It had to be done by July 1st, and then he left and went north. Well, meanwhile, Smith, he's up coming into Fort Benton, and he's not expecting to run into Meagher. And so he meets Carpenter, who's already up there waiting for the guns, and we've got the paperwork. He signs over permission for Carpenter to arrange for transportation, storage, and yada, yada, yada for the guns when they show up, and then Smith heads toward Virginia City. So Thomas Francis Meagher on the 10th of June, he gets the word down at Virginia City that the guns were at Fort Benton. Who sent that letter? It was in the paper, and the guns weren't at Fort Benton. He got some bad information. There was 2 people up there. Carpenter was up there already because he'd been sent up right away when they got word that the guns were being released. And but they didn't know where they were going to be, where they were going to come immediately. But they had to stay under federal escort, so they had to go to Camp Cook. But they didn't know that. And then the other person who was up at Fort Benton by then was Wilberforce Saunders. And Saunders was up there because he had come back from the States early. He left his family on this steamboat, took the fast way across to south of Montana, and then came up on the stagecoach with Sherman's inspector, Colonel Lewis. He was on the same stagecoach. Maybe that was arranged by telegraph because they had telegraph connection at Fort Hall. But anyhow, he was in town, and he had to move their first house in Virginia City was a log cabin across the street from the planter's house, and that's where he had his offices. And then they had a new house that was 2 miles outside of town, and they had to make sure that it was getting moved into town, and it was just down the street from where the Meaghers lived. And so he was just now moving that house, and he had to make sure it was done. So he said that's why he came back, but as soon as he got that going, then he gave his first political speech from Content's Corner, right? And he's in the middle of a campaign, which probably contributed to why he wanted to come back early. But Saunders has gone up there because he's waiting for his wife. So Saunders is up there, and so is Carpenter. Who sent that letter that was wrong is amazing to me. But it may be Carpenter, because Carpenter did not have military experience, and the 13th Infantry was coming over the levee, and they probably had ordnance being unloaded and so forth to go to what would eventually become Fort Shaw. So on the 15th, he heads up to Fort Benton, and by the 21st, this is really important, every single soldier in the Montana Territorial Militia is out at Camp Ida Thurman on the Shields River. Meagher had decided, because of the threat out there, that it was time to move him to forward deployment, so he moved him from Camp Elizabeth Meagher by Bozeman, where they'd been doing patrolling around the passes, moved him over to the Shields River, and they were all out there or on their way, except for, the other ones who weren't out there were the 42-man detail that had to be sent down to relieve C.F. Smith. The commander of C.F. Smith had sent up Mitch Boyer, doubled his pay per day from $5 to $10 a day to come up with a trader to get help and get supplies. And so Meagher was responding to that request. So 42 people were down there from Hinson's company, and everybody else was at Camp Ida Thurman, except for Meagher and Thurman had come into town to make a report, so he wasn't out there. But and then a handful of officers in Helena, Howie, Beadler, Hereford, the sheriff, who was being tasked to line up the next company. At the first company had already gone from Helena, had already gone down to Ida Thurman, and who else? Fisk, who was the quartermaster's assistant up there, and Featherston, who was the assistant hangman. It's interesting that when there's a couple of, at least one place in the newspapers where they're cajoling these guys, and they refer to Beadler as the AOJ, or HOJ, and I had to look that up, and that was a term of art, hand of justice. And then Featherston was referred to as the AHOJ, assistant hand of justice. What that meant is a dog whistle kind of thing. But those guys were the ones that were still up in Helena. And so no word from DeLacy. Beam is out there, and he takes this opportunity with everybody in the field to finalize the organization of the 1st Montana Cavalry, and that's in the book. And that was, that was the real, no kidding, 1st military unit for Montana. And then from Helena he leaves. Marr leaves. He's three days behind a 12-man detail led by Sergeant John Sullivan. John Sullivan was in Curtis's scout unit, and he got detailed by Curtis to go north with 6 teams to pick up the howitzers that were going to be in that load of arms, because each one needed horses to pull them, the caissons and so forth. So Sullivan had already left with his 11-man detail, and he was up there 3 days. He was 3 days in front of Marr, right? And then Smith signed the paperwork for Carpenter. And then this is really interesting. Suddenly out of nowhere, Beadler shows up on the Graham Wagon Road. He comes up out of Confederate Gulch on the back road, and he shows up in Fort Benton. And he's got 2 prisoners with him. And the Fort Benton correspondent writes about it, saying, well, it's amazing that they're walking. Usually he kills them. That's what he said. And Beadler says, well, I got the drop on them, and they stole $4,000 or whatever. Well, what's interesting about this is they would go into Munson's court, and the first court date for Marr County, remember they were using those 2 counties for their judicial calendar. First court date was August 1st, and they have a jail there in Diamond City. Well, they have a jail up in Fort Benton too. It's an old one run down. But the point is, to get him back down for court, he'd have to come up and get him. But he left him in Fort Benton. And as soon as he saw Smith, he jumps on the stagecoach behind Smith's stagecoach, right? So if you look at the stage arrivals in Helena, you got the Hambley coach coming in with Smith's family, and then right behind it you have the Express Wells Fargo with Beadler. He's the only militia officer in the whole picture. So that means that when the Sun River got to be calm enough to cross, because some of the Diamond R freight had been turned over on the ferry, so they had to wait. It was flooding, and that's why Smith was waiting up there on his boat, living on the boat. And he finally had to leave the afternoon of the 23rd. When the Sun River got calm enough for coaches to cross, whenever they crossed, whether it was the next day, they couldn't have made it by that night because they left too late, but if they crossed on the 24th or the 25th, whenever that was, Beadler was right behind him, right? So, meanwhile, Thomas Francis Marr has left Helena. He's probably stayed at the Dearborn Inn because he liked the buffalo steaks there, and he was probably waiting for the river to clear too, and then he goes north. So nobody knows for sure, but it was south of the Sun River on the 24th or the 25th. Marr and Smith met each other, and they had a field change of command, which is normal operation for military officers. Salute, say, here you are, and goodbye. And then apparently he did. He was asked by Smith to go and do something, help with the guns. So Marr heads north, and if he did have anybody with him, it would have been Penny, because Penny by then he had talked into being an aide de camp. Penny would have turned and gone back with his principal officer to write orders. So Marr was going north by himself, and he would have gone right by Beadler, coming south on the Wells Fargo coach. And the other thing is, up at Sun River, Carpenter finally got tired of waiting for the guns, and he heads south once he sees in the paper, because it's in the paper that Marr's going to get the guns, because he's coming north. He heads south on the stagecoach with a woman, a mysterious woman. And I don't know who it is, but he gets down and he checks into the planter's house with this mysterious woman, and she's kind of with him for a while, for the summer at least. But he passes through Sun River, and he had an opportunity there to advise or connect up with Meagher. Whether or not they did, I can't say. So that's the change of command. Here's the hand receipt that was signed on the 7th of July. When Meagher got in there on the 1st, there's no boat. There's nobody. I mean, the only person there is Sanders. And I've got the full account of what he said, because there's no sense quibbling with it. He wrote up the full account 2 days before the very first St. Patrick's Day in Butte, right? It's in the Butte Intermountain. St. Patrick's Day has been declared in Ireland, and so Butte decides to have its very first St. Patrick's Day, and he has a thing in the Butte Intermountain about Thomas Francis Meagher going crazy and so on and so forth. You can draw your own conclusions, but I recommend that you read it, because I didn't realize it was so long before he actually wrote a comprehensive statement. But so Sanders was there because he came up, and you'll see that in the statement. And he left his wife farther down river, got antsy, came up and came in on a mule off the Gallatin, which had come to the mouth of the Mariah. So he rides in on a mule, and when he gets there, he sees these people coming in with Meagher and his staff. But then he doesn't say who the staff is. The only staff person he says is Major Boyce. Well, Major Boyce is a new guy that showed up. It probably didn't know him, but if anybody else that was a staff person, Saunders would have known those guys. I mean, he rented out his office to the quartermaster for $150 a month. I mean, he knew all. They were attorneys. He knew them all. So that's a big mystery why he couldn't remember who those staff people were. And the likely staff person would have been Beadler, because his job was to go get the guns because he wasn't tied up in the Helena court date. Okay, so this ordinance hand receipt that was signed by Carpenter, Carpenter, like with the rest of the state on the 3rd, he finds out Meagher's dead. So he and his friend, his lady friend, they get back on the stagecoach. They go clear back up to Sun River, and they sign the hand receipt, which is kind of cool when you think about it. And here's what the hand receipt, there's more detail to it. It's in the book, but they signed for a full battery of mountain howitzers. That's a lot of stuff. That's saddles, bridles, all kinds of stuff to make a howitzer battery work. And they're just the tube on it is 220 pounds. But there's a lot of weight there. But Sullivan's and his men would have picked those up, and you could carry a few things in those caissons, a few individual weapons, if you wanted to. Then there's 300 rounds for each howitzer. And those 300 rounds each have about, 2.5 pounds of powder attached to them. And they're in long, skinny boxes. And the shot shell and canister. And then there's 2,500 stand. That means you get a rifle like the one that the Fetterman people had when they were killed, and you have the bayonet, you have the waist belt, you have the pouch, you got all the stuff that goes with one of those rifles. So that fills up 982 cases, right? So you got 125 200-pound cases of rifles, and then 982 cases of accoutrements. And you got all the ammunition for the howitzers plus the howitzers. And then you have 750,000 rounds of cartridges. That's a huge amount of ammunition. It was almost as though the arsenal down at St. Louis was cleaning out its stuff because they knew nobody was going to be using those kind of weapons again. But they showed up on, and that alone is 37 tons, right? So Meagher's gone. Smith's going down there. He tells Howie, get me a place to store this stuff when it comes in. Curtis, later on, when he's answering questions from the U.S. Marshal that came after Howie, has to answer, well, what's this about a shanty that you had in Helena? And he said, well, Beadler and Howie and myself and Curtis, well, this is Curtis talking, one other guy, we pooled $160, $170 in gold dust, gave it to Howie to buy the lumber. This is what I kind of remember it looking like. And then we went on down the Yellowstone, and while we were gone, the carpenters built this shanty, and they called it the shanty, right above Clore Street, right above Clore Street on the hill. Well, Clore is now Park. And I've been over to look at it, and I have to assume this is accurate. But there's a building there that's not exactly these measurements, but it's got the big door on the east end, and it's thick and does all these different things, but it's got windows in it now. And if you go over there on the corner of Howie, remember Howie comes down and then it doglegs out to Park. There's a yellow building, and it's a house. There's a skinny house in the front, and it's a big fat house in the back. I think there's a chance that this shanty is that big house in the back. That may actually be it. I've checked the property records, and it has a real mysterious origin. And that's the only area in that year that wasn't yet platted, was right down in there. So the shanty may still be here, but I can't say for sure. But what happened was there was a big reorganization. You can read about that. But they signed people up for 6 months, and Howie's down at Camp Ida Thurman with all these unhappy people who were happy, but now they're not happy. And he congratulates them for holding off the Indians and doing a great job and all that, and please sign up for 6 months. And, well, why should we? Well, General Terry's come through from the Department of Dakota saying, well, we're going to get these guys paid, and his guy, General Auger, saying we're going to pay him. Well, that was never appropriated. But I don't think being paid was part of it. Just, what are we going to do that's worth doing? Because it's now July 30th and winter's coming. And he says, we're going to have a big winter operation. We're going to go down, we're going to kill Indians. Well, that's a good idea, right? And it's a variation on what Marr was saying. To the victors go the spoil. And you'll see stuff throughout where people are saying, well, if I get that horse herd, you can get so much per horse, and So anyhow, they were motivated to build a winter camp. And the other thing that Howie did is he turned that around, and they started re-enlisting, but he decided that they were too exposed down there at the mouth of the Shields, and he moved everybody 3 miles up the river to where Livingston is now, right at the base of Bozeman Pass, and they started to build their winter camp there. And so they were talking 6-month enlistments, building a winter camp, getting ready for a major offensive in the winter where they're going to catch these people when they just can't get away. And I think they probably would have killed a lot of Indians. I really do. Because, for example, when DeLacy's 42 men showed up across from Fort C.F. Smith, the commander that had replaced the one that had asked for help, he'd gone south with Jim Bridger and the relief column from Fort Kearney. So the new guy won't let the Montana militia. He won't not only will let him into the fort, he won't let him cross the river. Right? He won't let him get on the ferry. So these guys are over there on the other side of the river looking across at the federal soldiers in the fort saying, what's your problem? Well, if you look at the diaries of the officers in the fort, they're saying, it's like having a biker gang across the way wanting to come in your house. I mean, these guys were really rough-looking people. They were called, a hard case. They got officers, but they don't pay attention to them. We're not letting those guys around us. Well, meanwhile, the ones over, this is classic militia regular stuff. But on the other side of the river, the militia, the 42 militiamen in Henson's company, who had all been a lot of them had been in the service, are saying, we know why you don't want us in there. You don't want your guys deserting to join us, right? Which there's probably some truth to that. So anyhow, let me see what we got. I lost my train of thought. So LaForge, you'll see him mentioned. He wrote a book, or his material was in a book called The Diary of a White Crow. But he was a young 17-year-old guy, and he was riding with these people. He was in the 3-month militia, and he was in the 6-month militia. And he said they were border trash. They were ruffians. They were bad guys. But he stayed with it. He liked being in it, right? And well, anyhow, it's an interesting situation. So these guys, they haven't mutinied yet. But what they have done is they've moved their patrolling base to the West Bank. Howie said, I want you all to go home and get your friends and have them come back so we can swell our ranks. So they go in home to recruit. When one of the companies from Salmon River had ridden in, led by a captain named Weston. And Weston, since they're all furloughed, he goes down with his brother and 2 other guys, and they start prospecting for gold down the Yellowstone, right? And he gets killed in a real bad way. And so when he disappears, one of the survivors come up and said, last time we saw him, it wasn't looking good for him. Howie mobilizes some of the men left in camp into a 75-man raid. He takes 2 howitzers. And the thing about mountain howitzers is you can you can strap them to the back of mules, and you can move that way across rough country instead of towing them. And so he takes 2 of them that way, and they go down, and they get down to and it's a hard march. He takes 3 days rations. They go like crazy to go down there. They get to the South Boulder by Big Timber, and there's an ambush waiting for them. There's a bunch of Indians, probably from Beartooth's band. He's a Crow chief with an attitude. And so they set up the howitzers, and they blast away at the crossing, and they scare off the people who are ambushing them, and then they cross in 2 places, and they chase them across the flat ground, clear down toward the Stillwater River. And in the process, they find three soldiers from Fort C.F. Smith that have new guns, because the relief to Fort C.F. Smith brought the second Allen conversion, the ones that fire, you don't have to stand up, you just can reload them from the rear end of the trap door. But they've been necked down to 50 caliber from 58 caliber. And they save those guys. One of them ends up dying, but they've killed a lot of around them with their new guns, which, by the way, Black Elk talks about that. The wagon box fight, which took place down at Kearney, and then the hayfield fight that took place at C.F. Smith, when those fights happened, the soldiers and the civilians were armed with the second Allen conversion. And when you read what Black Elk says, because his people were involved in that, there was just tremendous casualties. It was just a totally different picture. So they get down, they find the remains of Weston and another guy, and they've been, it's just scattered around, and parts of the I think Beartooth's camp. And then on the way back, Captain Nelson's coming in with a whole new column of 80 men. So you've got a total of 157 men out in the field, and they're coming back up, and they met probably down around Big Timber. And Nelson's also got he's pulling a howitzer. So then they come together, 157 men. They go back up, and they go to the new camp where Livingston is today. And and there's a couple incidents you can read about where one of the men tried to kill an officer, and the officer killed him in a gunfight, and some other things that happened that are really quite interesting. But then the strength on September 23rd is 423. It had come down. It was like 541 at the end of that first militia, but now they had it up to 423, and this is according to Colonel Hardy, who later came to audit the books of this thing they call the Montana Indian War, but his best estimate, and I agree with him, even after a lot of the officers were sloughed off during the reorganization, they had 32 officers, 391 enlisted men, and they were mostly at Camp Ida Thurman, and they were under the command of Howie. So what happened is Howie goes into town, into Virginia City, to get help to get more winter clothing and supplies for the winter offensive. He goes in, and he finds out that General Terry has been told by General Sherman, who's been told by somebody up higher, that there's going to be a peace commission and no more military action, and disband the militia and disarm them and yada yada. Because when they started enlisting new people, some of the people didn't want to enlist, and they left and went to Helena, and they took their guns and ammunition with them. So some of the regulars from now Fort Shaw were finding that some of these guns, and so they wanted the militia stopped because of the peace commission that was in play, and also they wanted them disarmed. So Howie comes back, and he reads Terry's order, and all these guys are in formation on Sunday night, all of them, and they're all getting ready to go do it to somebody, and they're told, we don't need you anymore. Well, that didn't go over very big. It took till about Tuesday morning, because now it's September 25th. Winter's coming on. They haven't been mining. They haven't been working. Nobody's paid them. They're told they got to turn all their stuff in. And so they have an insurrection. And they tell Howie he can stick it where the sun doesn't shine. And there's a lot of detail in there about that. And so they did it in 2 groups. A group of 16 in Company A, they just got up one morning, grabbed their stuff, and took off down the river. And their plan was to overtake another supply wagon from Bozeman and just steal all their stuff and keep going. And in the way, Captain Thomas Baum, who was a clothing store owner in Virginia City, he tried to stop him. So they threw a rope around him and they dragged him back and forth through the Yellowstone until he drowned. So he was taken and he's buried in the Bozeman City Cemetery. And then 2 days later, Captain Robert Hughes from Helena, who was an experienced officer, he was more deliberate. Howie said he woke up or didn't wake up. He realized after a little while that he wouldn't even know who was with Hughes, that his men had totally controlled all the weapons, all the improved weapons, all the howitzers, all the pack stock, all the extra mules, everything. They took everything that they wanted, and they didn't take those muskets. And they went across the river, and they got packed up for a long journey to the southwest before winter. And so they did that. So when you think about it, you had about 180 men, maybe no more than that, maybe less, because a few might have changed their mind. But they were probably the best armed, best experienced, best mounted military unit on the Northern Plains. And whoever's going to mess with them is going to have a big problem, because these guys, they may not have looked, but even the people that saw them when they were riding out of town said they looked good. They all knew what they were doing. They'd been in the military. And so this LaForge says that they attacked C.F. Smith. He says that. He has no way of knowing that directly. But what the diaries at C.F. Smith say is they showed up, and they came in, and then they left a little bit at a time. I don't think they had the howitzers with them or anything. I don't know. I mean, in C.F. Smith. But the last one left October 25th. The last of the Montana militia left going south. And then they had an engagement with the Indians somewhere south and east of Fort C.F. Smith on the Bozeman Trail. That's an interesting piece of history to me. And then if you check the returns for posts around the West, you'll see all kinds of Robert Hugheses signing up to go back in the Army. And he could have gone in any one of them, and nobody would have known the difference, right? So what an interesting bunch of people. So that was 1867 in the late summer. They were trying to beat the winter. And then meanwhile, Howie, they ride up over the pass. The other guys go the other way, and he takes the people who've decided to follow orders. And then when they get over by Bozeman somewhere, they split, and some go to Virginia City and some go to Helena with Howie. The ones who go to Virginia City go with Nelson, I think. But about that time, Captain Maddock, who has the second Helena company that was supposed to leave under Hereford's son baby got brain fever, and he was out of the picture. And then Howie got promoted. So this Maddock came out of nowhere, and he's a veteran from the Civil War, and he's over in Blackfoot City. He takes 50 guys, and they go off down to the Musselshell River, because the tribes are harassing the copper miners and people down there, and some businessmen from Helena go with them, right? Well, now Maddock has set up Camp Howie down there in that little notch going over to Martinsdale onto the Musselshell. He set up Camp Howie. They did their thing. And then now they've gone down, and they're meeting Howie as he's coming away from the fort. The place at Livingston was called Camp Thomas Francis Marr. They named it after him. And so they show up with their own howitzer, and Howie thinks for a minute, well, maybe these guys can help me go get the stuff from those other guys. And so he writes about it. And so he puts the proposition to Maddock and his 50 guys, who are untainted, because all the other people wouldn't lift a hand to stop these others from headed out. That made all the sense in the world to them. They probably had a job for the winter or something, a place to go. But Maddock and his guys were untainted, and so what Howie says is, well, they thought about it and they voted on it. And 26 of them said, yeah, they'd do it. They'd go fight those guys as long as they can have all their stuff. And Howie goes, that was just it was not going to work. So they all, the Maddock people joined with Howie's going to Helena, and off they went. And so they got back, and the Virginia City people muscled out. They were discharged by October 3rd. It was all according to Hoyle. They were paid off with appraised stuff, not guns, horses and bridles and so forth. And then in Helena, it was much more complicated and kind of mysterious, because it's not clear what happened in Helena. It's just everybody was like in on the deal, but Maddock put his people for about a week out here by 10 Mile by the old stage stop, going toward Clancy. Wouldn't let them come into town until they were properly mustered out. And then finally they were all compensated in some fashion, right? So, and then whatever was left was in the shanty. So you saw the picture of the shanty. This is the arsenal. When they got back down to Virginia City, the staff was operating good, well. It was, what's his name? Hamilton Cummings put out bids. Or he said, if you got any complaints against us, you want to be paid, tell me now or forever hold your peace. You got till the 15th. Carpenter was putting out bids for a new armory, a new arsenal. And this is what it turned out to be. And then later on, Smith, there's a lot of stuff in there about how he pushed the appropriation through the legislature. And so then once he got the money for this, because he'd already used his own money to buy the land underneath it, because he needed to get this solved, because he had all these guns and stuff sitting around this cabin out in the weather. And four howitzers. Remember, there had been 7, now 3 were gone. So he's able to point to 4 howitzers, and nobody was talking about the other 3, right? So meanwhile, up in Helena, when after this got done, then Smith goes back to ask for money for a thing that they got up there in Helena, and the legislature wasn't going for it, because I'm sure they understood that there's not everything's there. And so, and by then, Carpenter had used the telegraph. By then, there's a new telegraph line between Virginia City and Helena. It got in about October 12th. They'll have to check that. They were putting in 28 miles a day, and they just went like crazy. And then the first operator came in. People who had bought script got to use the telegraph for free, and it's pretty interesting. And so Carpenter sends a telegraph, and the telegraph's here in the archives. It says, form a provost, armed provost, go find people that have stolen weapons. Basically, that's the essence of it. And I'm thinking, he must not know about that shanty. And he's right there in Virginia City. And meanwhile, Curtis, when he goes to answer the questions later, when the U.S. Marshal, after Howie, starts asking questions about the shanty, he says that, well, yeah, Smith was in on it. Smith made me the ordnance officer. He told me to ship 100 guns to Missoula. And so you're going, okay, now what was going on there? And so one of the things that has to be remembered is all this stuff, all these vouchers are out, and I guess you got to put your best foot forward to make sure that the U.S. government reimburses the Territorial of Montana, right? Because there's a lot of money out, and nobody's been paid yet. And those are changing hands like a currency. Like Creighton, he was buying up a bunch of them. So, and the voucher, the way they did the voucher was, I would sell you 100 horses, and I would say 100 horses, first-class horses, and I would sign the voucher, and then the quartermaster would take it and have Smith sign the voucher. So you got a signed and countersigned voucher from the territory. Feds are supposed to reimburse. That was basically that simple. This is the arsenal, and we can talk about where that's at now. All right, so we talked about mutineers, so let's not forget the scoundrels. What happened is this ammunition started finding its way north through Healy. And that's all laid out how that happened, and so not 750,000 rounds, but many hundreds of thousands, at least 225,000 rounds, plus the ammo that's in the howitzer ammunition, and but probably more, probably a lot more. And that's bottom line how it ended up at Fort Whoop-Up with Healy, where the ammunition was for all that gunfire that day on the Belly River. And then I want to go back. This is the last slide. This is that fellow that I told you about that was up in the Cypress Hills in the middle of his group. This is him later when he's in his... You can see he is a big man, and but he's older now. And he's wearing a uniform that's been given to him by General Hugh Scott, who is the commandant of the West Point Military Academy and then later on was the chief of staff for the U.S. Army during the First World War, and then after that became a real ethnologist, trying to capture Indian languages and doing that, going out where there's trouble spots and trying to solve it in a good way. Well, he and Hugh Scott were good buddies, and that's where he got that uniform. And here's the thing. This guy was Big Brave when you saw him last, but by now he's become Mountain Chief because he's one of Mountain Chief's sons. And Mountain Chief's band, let's go back through it again. You've heard about Pete Alchild being the one that killed Malcolm Clark, that precipitated the Marias Massacre. That was from Mountain Chief's band. He's one of the guys that's in the picture that I first showed you. He's sitting next to Big Brave. Mountain Chief's band was the one that was with Beartooth, the Crow Chief that had all the troublesome Indians. They were being exiled from the Blackfeet, and so Mountain Chief's band is with Beartooth that the Montana militia want to ride against come winter. By the way, a returning trader named Charlie Smith, who had gone with the Lacey's expedition, he had some of his horses stolen, so he's looking for them, and he goes with the help of the Crow Chief Blackfoot to go to Beartooth's camp, which is 80 lodges. Blackfoot's got about 75 lodges, and he gets his horse. And he sees all these other horses with MM for a brand. Well, that's Montana militia. So these guys have already been out stealing Montana Territorial militia stock. And so he says, well, aren't you going to give them back? And the Mountain Chief says, if they want them, they can come and get them. So then you'll see that they tell Charlie Smith that they're the ones that killed Little Dog. Well, Little Dog was Healy's friend up there on the Sun River in one of those actions back in 1866. He was one of the best warriors the Blackfeet had. Mountain Chief was also one of the best. And he had tried to get along and get his people stop them from stealing horses, and he actually brought 12 horses into the Indian Agency at Fort Benton, but on his way back, he and his son Fringe were killed by Mountain Chief's band. So that's not a good thing. And then Charlie Smith says they're saying that they're the ones, not just Beartooth's crowd, but Mountain Chief's Indians. His band of, I guess, 5 or 6 well, Mountain Chief, his 2 sons, and 2 nephews are the ones that killed John Bozeman. He just said that straight out. Well, if that's a fact, they precipitated another war, right? So, or helped precipitate it. The thing about Mountain Chief is when you read the Blackfeet papers, when Baker rode north to exact revenge for the Malcolm Clark slaying, and he went to the wrong camp and he killed all the people in Heavy Runner's band, 173 to 217 is a rough estimate. He was looking for Mountain Chief. He had 20 arrest warrants. Well, Mountain Chief wasn't there. Well, what happened? Well, Mountain Chief says, not big Brave, but his dad said, well, I had a dream. I dreamt that I was laying on the ground and all these people were shooting at my dead body. So I decided it was time to go to Canada. So they had just, based on his dream, decided to go to Canada, and they just weren't there. And the other thing about this band is you'll see in the story that a man named Brings Down the Sun talks about the Old North Trail and how he used to, they used to ride up and down that trail great distances and how he knew every nook and cranny in the trail. Well, Brings Down the Sun, who testified to that and is quoted often, was in Mountain Chief's band. So that means that Big Brave, who took his father's name and became Mountain Chief, so in this picture he is the famous the next Mountain Chief, is the last hereditary chief of the Blackfeet Nation. And he's the one that signed over Glacier Park to us. And he would communicate with Hugh Scott, the general, telling him how good all the farmers around Hart Butte were doing, and they were finally figuring out how to adjust to new life. He was quite a guy, really. And he died when he was 92. So I think that's kind of cool. And one of the things that I've always felt was that we're all Montanans, and so I'm tickled. Like Charlie Russell has painted these paintings from the Native American point of view, and he realized what was being lost there. And over at the Military Museum, there's been a big effort to incorporate all the things that Native American soldiers have done in all the wars since this one, which is pretty darn phenomenal. Just ask the Japanese on New Guinea what the Native American guardsmen did down there. They're still good soldiers or warriors. But then they go and they have a life, which that's what it's all about. So there's been a big effort to do it, but I've always felt that there needs to be a way to get it closer together. And one time we had a meeting of officers. I was in the Guard for quite a long time, and I had asked the question, why don't we put the battle honors for the Native Americans on our flags? I mean, we've got all these other things we've done, but what about the Native Americans? They were defending their families and so on and so forth. They're militia of a different culture. And nobody took that serious, but I'm pretty serious about that. I'm very serious about it. And so I know we use their names and all that stuff, but I was trying to think of how to do this. And when I went down to, I spent some time down at the Northern Cheyenne and some time at the Flathead, or the Salish Kootenai, time up on the Blackfeet. And I've learned a lot in the sweat lodges and all that. And, I know what I don't know, which is a lot. But I've had people ask, well, when are they going to have a statue on the front lawn of an Indian, like Mars? It's a good question. My feeling personally, though, is that statues are kind of a Western, they're from our culture and all that. And I don't know if there's plenty of good artists, plenty of good Native American artists. But so I've been thinking about that the last couple days before coming here today. And so while I was thinking about what could we do that really would honor them, so then I remembered that one of the times I was up at Browning, I was in the parking lot at the food store there, and this young guy comes up to me and he sells me this piece of art, and I'm a pushover. So I got the art and I brought it home, but I didn't know why I did it, and I didn't know what it was. I thought it was like a paint by numbers thing, and it's I went out in the garage yesterday to get it because I got it with my stuff out there, and I looked at it and I thought, God, who is that? So I started Googling. This is Mountain Chief. And if you Google Mountain Chief, this is this Mountain Chief. And he was a no-kidding, big-time American statesman, really, some of the stuff he did. It's fun to read about him in the middle, listening to a committee testimony in Congress and standing up when everybody else wants to go to sleep and singing one of his war songs and scaring the bejesus out of people. But he's really quite a guy. And you can see he's just quite a guy. So I got that, and I thought, that's amazing that I got this. But maybe a painting, maybe a statue, I don't know. I guess I'm not too excited about that. But so then I was out. I was working on what I was going to tell you today, and I looked out at the sleeping giant. The sleeping giant, is the bear tooth. And the sleeping giant lies between Little Prickly Pear and the Malcolm Clark Ranch in the Old North Trail that goes down through the gates of the mountains. And the sleeping giant is actually a term of art. It's a business promotional thing, really. I mean, it's not a formal name for anything, and there's nothing wrong with it. But I'm thinking, well, I don't know, but it would be great if that was called Mountain Chief. But it won't be, not in my lifetime. But when I look at it, I'll be thinking of Mountain Chief. Okay, that's all I got. Any questions?